Hi, my name is Eric Mamajek. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at the Artificial Sky Conference. I wish I could be there in person. I have a NASA meeting the first few days of this week, which is going to take all my time during the day. Um, I wanted to briefly talk about the history of the IAU Working Group on Star Names that just started up in 2016. Talk a little bit about the motivation and history, where this came from, maybe a little bit on where it's going. I'm currently an astronomer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that I joined in 2016, and I was previously a professor of physics and astronomy at University of Rochester. I mainly study stars and exoplanets and debris disks and circumstellar matter. Um, but loved the stars for a very long time. And this topic of naming of celestial objects is something that caught my attention very early on. Just wondering where all these names for, planetary satellites and surface features and the stars came from. So why names for stars and exoplanets? Why not just alphanumeric designations? You have to remember, so coming from the astronomy community, we've now got catalogs of thousands to millions of stars and galaxies, etc. Nowadays, we usually just assign an acronym and an index number or a celestial position and be done with it. But it's a lot easier to remember simple names. So things like Vega, for example, if an astronomer mentions Vega, we already have an idea of what star that is. It's a lot easier to remember than long alphanumeric strings of numbers. If you go to the Sinbad database of nomenclature and bibliographic references, it has 62 alphanumeric designations for Vega, and the vast majority of astronomers will not recognize any of them. They may know an HR number, an HD number here or there, or Alpha Lyra, but most of the astronomers will just know it by Vega. So, names can make communication easier. This was certainly a motivation for adding some names for navigational stars. Some names were added in the 20th century for bright stars to help pilots with navigating. And in familiarity with the objects, as you study them more and you understand them better, that also lends itself to naming. So, for example, the satellites of Jupiter, were originally known by Roman numerals, and nowadays we just know them as Europa, Io, Ganymede, and Callisto. Um, you wouldn't go back to knowing them by their Roman numerals. These are worlds. These are interesting places to explore. They're worthy of a name. Names are interesting pointers to culture and history. It's been interesting to discover um, uh, aspects of astronomical history and astronomical traditions from different cultures that I was unaware of just looking at the names. So they're kind of like an old card catalog from a library, that you would open up and point yourself to some interesting literature. Um, I think they're an interesting place to document the cultures of our world. Um, and we've got an endless supply of celestial objects that could store cultural information, things like extinct languages and mythological figures, etc. Um, and the public also, when we're studying these interesting astronomical objects, I've heard a few times, you discover these interesting objects and then you call them these long, boring alphanumeric designations. J1407b, for example. Well, they say, why don't you just give it some interesting, mythological name or name it for something interesting? Um, I don't think it serves the science well when we give them very long designations. And for most objects, that's probably okay. But when we're talking about things like worlds, numbers won't do. So why the IAU? Well, you really need an international group to do this. And I think that was part of the motivation for the IAU in the first place is astronomers from different countries were finding inconsistencies between their names for example, lunar surface features and the constellations and the boundaries for the constellations. And so the IAU provided an avenue for astronomers around the world to come together and come to some agreement on things that they had in common. And we've now seen a century of success there. We have agreed upon, coordinate frames and names of constellations and standards on data, etc. So the IAU can do that. This is a brief history of some of the celestial nomenclature issues that have come up during the IAU and briefly before the IAU. There was early 20th century. Some of the topics again were lunar surface features, People from different countries were mapping the lunar surface and using different names. Um, Variable stars used the names of constellations, and there was not good agreement on the names of some of the constellations and the boundaries between the constellations. And that was one of the first things the IAU resolved in the 1920s, was coming to the 88 IAU constellations, their names, their boundaries, their abbreviations, to facilitate variable star designations. The mid 20th century brought the space age, so spacecraft visiting other celestial bodies in our solar system. We went through this remarkable era between the late 50s and around 1990, where the primary planets were all visited for the first time. And many of the satellites had were also visited and had their first images. So we had this bumper crop of imaging of new celestial objects and naming, and then this new field of planetary science and understanding the geology of these worlds. And that required standard names. In the 1960s, we also had a proliferation and discovery of asteroids and comets. Early in the IAU, there was only about 1,000 asteroids known. Now there's up over 600,000 numbered asteroids with very accurate orbits, and over 1 million more that are just fragments of orbits. And so there was a need for rapid designation of these bodies. There was also a burgeoning amateur astronomy community. So the IAU the Minor Planet Center would announce that the discovery of an object and need to dispense that information quickly and have consistent nomenclature. The 1970s brought this was an era where we still had paper journals, and we had catalogs of thousands and thousands of stars and extragalactic objects, and it became very prohibitive for cross-referencing them between surveys. And so there was a huge effort to digitize these catalogs, make them available on disk, and then eventually the internet by the 1990s. And there was all sorts of inconsistent use of names. You would have the astronomers studying the LMC have some clusters they would call B1, B2, B3, B4. There would be people studying molecular clouds that would call their objects B1, B2, B3. It got very confusing. And so the IAU started IAU Commission 5 and the working group designations to sort of straighten this out and come to some agreed upon guidelines. And to a certain extent, that situation has improved a lot. And now, you can publish new works and have objects designated with using these guidelines very quickly. Now, what they didn't spend much time on, however, was the actual proper names of stars. And this is one of the oversights over the past century that we ran into about a decade ago. The 1990s brought the discovery of the first exoplanets. We're now the exoplanet generation. The number of exoplanets known doubled about every 2.5 years. For about 25 years, it's leveled off a little bit recently. And the question came up, well, how do you designate these planets? How do you do we assign them proper names? What about their host stars? So I'll delve a little bit into that history, but really the history of exoplanet naming and the world working group star names are really intertwined. So by about 2013, the IAU had not yet really asserted itself on the naming of these bodies, and there was outside entities that were starting to provide names, and sometimes doing it for profit. And so the IAU executive committees and general secretary decided that they needed to do something about this. The community was too busy discovering the planets themselves. They weren't terribly interested. It was a small number of exoplanet astronomers interested in the topic that helped out on this. And they tried to open it up to public naming, and just allowing people to send suggestions to the IAU did not work very well. They got thousands and thousands of fairly low quality suggestions. It was tough to navigate those. So they decided to have more organized public naming campaigns. And that was the first Name ExoWorlds campaign in 2015. And this is where I started to get involved in this topic. And I sent an email on suggestions on how to do this, and I got recruited into this effort. And one of the topics came up was, well, do we name their stars? And so most of the committee members thought that was a good idea. Okay, well, if we're going to name the stars, what if they already have names? We don't want to rename those. What are the rules for the stars? Are there official names for IAU? Are there official IAU names for stars? And the answer was actually surprisingly no. So in the first campaign, there was about, I can't remember, it was about 14 stars, 31 planets, and some of them are around bright stars. and some of them had names that people were very familiar with, like Fomal and Pollux. But some ended up having rare names, and initially they were going to rename those stars in the public naming campaign. And I argued, no, they've had some of these had names that have been in literature for over a century or two. Some of these are just Latinized Arabic names that go back even further than that, but they were in this form for the past century or so. And so this motivated the need for a separate working group to research this. So if they were going to do these public naming campaigns in the future, and the IAU was wanted to do more of these after the 2015 campaign, it was clear we need some working group to straighten out the situation with star names, to research them and to standardize the names. And so I led a proposal in early 2016 that got accepted by the IAU Executive Committee in May of 2016, and that started Working Group Star Names. There was an opportunity here, right? There was people working on preserving astronomical heritage and researching celestial names and the various sky cultures and astronomical traditions. Let's help the IAU preserve these names. We could also standardize the names. So we know these names are floating around out there, either among these cultures or in astronomical literature. Why not standardize them and make sure they're not either used for some other object or misused? We can also help diversify the pool of IAU star names. Most of the names are Latinized Arabic names or Greek names, but there's many other cultures around the world that had their own astronomical traditions, and their names were not reflected in the names in common use by the international astronomical community. So, and we could help prepare the IAU for these future public naming campaigns. And these became quite popular. The 2015 campaign, the 2019 campaign, 2022 campaign. After the first one, they were popular enough that the IAU wrote in its strategic plan for the 2020s that they wanted to continue these campaigns because they were great outreach events. The public was excited to have the opportunity to name a celestial object. They learned about exoplanets. I recently met a young astronomer from Cameroon who actually participated in one of these campaigns several years ago, and it was a big event in Cameroon and was a good opportunity to teach the public about astronomy and stars and planets. So these were a great outreach event for the IAU. This is just the top page of the terms of reference for the WGSN and its triennial report. Hopefully some of these names are in the audience, but this was the initial group: myself, Beatrice Garcia, Dwayne Hamaker, Alejandro Lopez, Thierry Montmurl, Jay Pasikoff, Ian Ridpath, Yunli Shi, Chachen Sun, Robert Van Gent, and Hitoshi Yamoka. So our activities of the first triennium, we went through, the first thing we did was go through the most common names, for the most common about 280 names, and reviewed these, came to some agreement on which ones were the most widely used and which spellings were the most commonly used. We got some recommendations on names for different cultures, especially the issue of the Chinese names. That took some discussion. And so by the end of the first triennium, we had 280 of the common names passed. We accepted the 14 new name exoworlds names from the 2015 campaign. And we added 42 new cultural names, and here's a subset of those. And so we added, we've got Hindu, Persian, Mayan, Chinese, French, Wardaman, Persian, Coptic, Tahitian. So we were able to incorporate some of these cultural names that had been published for individual stars. You'll also see some of these have capital A's and little a's. One of the things we decided on was, since we were now in the era of exoplanetary systems, that we would actually assign the names to individual objects. Well, a lot of the stars are in multiple systems. So even though the light that had been looked at for thousands of years that was unresolved may have had some name, we decided to attribute that name specifically to the primary in that system. There was some cases where a system was resolved that we assigned multiple names. This is one of these beautiful constellation graphics by Pierre Barbier. This is Scorpius, of course, and this is just showing some of the cultural names. We were able to add some Chinese names, a Tahitian name, Khoikhoi, African culture, Wardaman, Aboriginal name, and a Hawaiian name. And some of these had multiple names in the literature, but not in very common use. Some of these had no names that we could find other than these particular cultural names. So we were able to bring some of these cultural names into common use for in Scorpius. So this is just a list of some of the products from Working Group Star Names in recent years. That IAU site has our annual reports, our triennial reports. Early on, we covered a lot of stars, about 200 of them. So we published 2 quick bulletins in 2016 that summarized the names, the initial names that we went through. A lot of these were the ones that were in use, you'd find in, for example, Kunich's work, and Allen's star names, etc. The ones that are most commonly used. The Working Group Star Name list is now up to 449. I believe probably about 150 of these or so are actually from the Name Extra Worlds campaign. So about 300 of these are the historical and cultural names. I list the old Working Group Star Name site that I originally started at University of Rochester. That's a little bit defunct now. I haven't updated it since 2021. And Suzanne Hoffman has kindly started as working group chair, I believe about a year or two ago. She has started a new site at exoplanet/star names. And the other great thing is they have now included the etymological information. So Doris Vickers has kindly taken on being chair of the etymology task group. So there's more we can do on these outside sites than on the IAU site itself. So that's great. There's sort of a one-stop shop now for etymological information. So some thoughts on Working Group Star Names and Name Exoworlds in general. First off, this is great now to see some ties between Working Group Star Names and Stellarium. Stellarium is a fantastic tool. I think it's been great to navigate and to see all the information. It's been compiled in there, the graphics, the information that's been stored about celestial names. I think it's a great avenue to retain the etymologies and to help store this information. It's a lot better than just static IAU page. So I think this is great. Working Group Star Names, we could use more expertise on indigenous names, especially the Americas and Africa. This has been a long-standing issue, but we could definitely use more expertise here. The census of sky cultures, you aim for completeness, but it's never going to be complete. It's sort of a never-ending quest. And so I think, over time, people will be adding more information on these sky cultures. And I'm glad to see, Stellarium is a place where that information can be stored, and hopefully some of these new cultural names can be ingested into the IAU list and adopted. We've tried to maintain continuity where possible. We've adopted names that were already in common use in the astronomical literature, with some very rare exceptions where there might have been confusion or duplication, and we might have made some minor changes. But we've been trying not to, quote unquote, rock the boat with the names that are already in common use. We would not have been taken seriously by the IAU if we were, renaming stars like Vega and Fomalhaut, for example. We already have some precedents for incorporating names from extinct constellations. We added Felis to one of the stars in Hydra. There's certainly other extinct constellations that could be used in the literature for star names. They're not being used for anything else. I don't think it would cause much confusion, and we can at least preserve that bit of their history with assigning those names to some stars. I think there are more eponymous names. We've already added Barnard Star. There's probably a couple dozen other cases, names that are already in common use. Some people have not liked that there's names of people, but most of these are, historical astronomers that I don't think would be very controversial. And if we call the system something else, I think it would just generate confusion. The names from the Name Exoworlds campaign, to be honest, have not quite caught on with the exoplanet community. It's unclear if they'll catch on in the coming years, or maybe it takes a generation. And I think part of that is because the naming has been it's been sort of a top-down solution with public and by using public naming. We haven't had the exoplanet astronomers really doing the naming yet. They've certainly participated in some of the Name Exoworlds campaigns, but I suspect what will probably happen is that some of the names may catch on for some of the more popular systems that are well studied, but I think it's going to take time. Obviously, naming all the stars and planets is untenable. I don't think that's the goal. I think working group star names should just focus on the bright naked eye stars, brighter than about 6 magnitude, and notable faint stars that are astrophysically interesting, and name exoworlds. And the newly formed working group exoplanetary system nomenclature should focus on the more notable exoplanetary systems. One question is, should we have public naming campaigns like Name Exoworlds, but just for the stars, and maybe for particular samples like nearby stars that may not necessarily have exoplanets known yet? We're finding, with in NASA, we're working on a project that's just starting up now. It'll take 20 years to search for Earth-like planets around nearby stars, and many of those stars just have designations. They don't have historical or cultural names. But I think it'll be easier to convey that information to the public if they did. I will say Working Group Star Names has had very little useful outside input after 7 years, and I hate to say that. We've had online forums. The group has been in existence for 7 years. We've had, the results have been publicized through the IAU press releases, etc. But we've had very few, serious attempts at input. Sometimes people just submit names of loved ones and intellectual property names, video game characters and stuff. But we've not had people bring like a lot of new research. I would say help. It would definitely be great to have further input from the cultural astronomy community on names that could be added to the IAU list. So help the IAU working group star names preserve astronomical traditions and celestial nomenclature. Please reach out, and Susan Hoffman is now chair of Working Group Star Names, so you have somebody there to talk to. So many thanks to the members of Working Group Star Names over the years that got the group going and are still part of the group. Many thanks to Susan Hoffman, who's now the Working Group chair, and to Doris Vickers, who's is the etymology lead for Working Group Star Names. They've brought a lot of energy to the group in the last couple of years. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak. And I wish I could be there in person. So thank you.